I will find him. I will find him. I will find him! The following is an in-depth story analysis. If you haven't seen this film, you might want to before watching this review. Man of Steel reminds me a little of the 1990 Flash pilot. That's an odd comparison, I know, but they're both generally lighthearted and optimistic DC characters given the Batman treatment after his huge success at the box office. The Flash started as a gritty, street-level crime drama with the Scarlet Speedster instead of the Dark Knight, accompanied by an opening theme written by Danny Elfman. Regardless of how counterintuitive that style might have seemed to anyone who had actually read a Flash comic, it worked for Batman, so why not expect lightning to strike twice? With Man of Steel, we have another DC movie co-plotted by Christopher Nolan and David Goyer, an attempt at a somewhat grounded Superman world, or as grounded as you can make a story about a guy who can levitate with no visible means of propulsion, named after a popular moniker for your superhero rather than using his actual name in the title, just like The Dark Knight, and scored, once again, by Hans Zimmer. The Flash started to find its own identity apart from Tim Burton's Batman as the series went on, and started to much more closely resemble its source material by the end of its first and only season. But it failed to find a following, unlike its currently running successor, which established its brighter tone immediately and is one of the most successful live-action comic book shows to date. Man of Steel, on the other hand, was a commercial success, though maybe not as successful as Warner Brothers was hoping. And while it's maybe disingenuous to compare the failure of a 26-episode season of television to a major movie franchise, we'll never really know if this approach would have continued to be successful with Man of Steel, or if it would have moved away from that moody, ultra-serious, Nolan-esque tone on its own, because the very next outing for this Superman is a fight with Batman himself. There's a surefire way to keep a polarized audience. Just add Batman! That's the world we live in now, folks. It's like water, batteries, salt, and sugar. Just add Batman. Now, I'm not saying Man of Steel turned Superman into Batman, nor am I saying it's a carbon copy of any of the Nolan Batman movies, but I think Warner's counted on its veteran Batman guard as a safe bet for a successful Superman reboot, as Superman generally isn't thought of as being as relevant today and certainly isn't as popular to audiences as Batman. And creating confidence in a big-budget Superman movie after Superman Returns was going to be tricky no matter what you did. A movie that was initially both commercially and critically successful, but seemed to age like Ang Lee's Hulk. There had never been a big screen approach to the character that wasn't in some way related to Richard Donner and Christopher Reeve's version, so I can certainly appreciate the enormous pressure to make something that had a high probability of success, especially when the hope was to use this movie to launch into a shared DC universe and finally play Marvel at their own game. And Warner's superhero track record wasn't sitting well with fans outside of Batman. We all know how that first attempt at a cinematic DC universe turned out. So while I wasn't impressed with the studio during this period for its play-it-safe attitude, also remember the standalone Justice League movie that got all the way to the casting stage before it was scrapped, I see why Warner's went with a proven storytelling team, even while I think the sloppiness on display in the screenplay for The Dark Knight Rises might have suggested Nolan and Goyer needed a break from superhero icons and heroes' journey stories. A number of writers that had long histories with Superman pitched stories before Nolan and Goyer got theirs greenlit while writing The Dark Knight Rises, including Grant Morrison, Jeff Johns, who's now involved with these movies, and Mark Waid, who famously walked out on Man of Steel and thought it was an absolute travesty. I'm not the biggest Mark Millar fan, and I have no idea what a Matthew Vaughn-directed Superman movie would look like, but their pitch was fascinating. They wanted to make an insanely ambitious 8-film epic, filmed at once, and each released a year apart, that would cover Superman's entire life history, from Krypton all the way to the sun-going supernova and Superman losing his powers. Now there's a bold, risky move, and one that would have screamed, Superman's already cool, as opposed to Snyder's much lamented by fans declaration of, let's make Superman cool again. So we've got the same guys who came up with Batman Begins writing what's essentially Superman Begins. It's another modern take on a classic superhero origin, postulating what his motivations might be and how the world might react to him if he lived in a universe more like our own than like some of the comics he comes from. In the same way Batman needs a compelling history to tell us why, after the death of his parents, he's out for justice rather than vengeance, Superman needs a practical explanation for why he uses his powers to save people rather than for selfish ends, in a world that seems to expect everyone with power to only use it to grab more. It attempts to reimagine an icon in a fresh and provocative way without losing the essence of the character and what he stands for, to explore the man himself rather than just what his costume represents. I find almost as much to sink my teeth into with Man of Steel's ideas initially, but it loses its way because those themes aren't as grounded in a human story about a man I fully appreciate and respect. It watches like Batman Begins if Bruce just did stuff but never talked about why. As always, my reviews are based on my most recent experience with a movie. Unlike my views on The Dark Knight Rises, my feelings on this one have changed dramatically over multiple watches, and I hate that I like it less now almost as much as I hated not falling in love with Rises. Because I had an almost Batman Begins experience with this in the theater. It is in a lot of ways very much my Superman, and finally brings some characters, ideas, and just a general tone from the contemporary page to screen I wasn't sure I'd ever see. Sure, we're doing Zod again, and he was popularized by Superman 2 and was a really obscure comic book villain before that, but there's a real emphasis here on the alien side of Superman and on the Kryptonian mythology that creates a fresh approach and helps to warrant an umpteenth Superman origin story. It's the opposite of the last son of Krypton approach to Superman throughout the 90s, making Clark more of a product of both worlds and emphasizing the immigrant experience. I was always more of a fan of Krypton than I was of Superman himself. I love the story of Jor-El and Zod's friendship and then rivalry on the heels of Oblivion, which parallels and foreshadows Superman and Lex Luthor, at least in continuities that portray them as friends first. And for a precious few moments, this movie dramatizes that relationship and establishes that fascinating argument of hope in humanity, or Kryptonianity, versus forcing your supposed superior will on a people you believe you must rule because they don't have the clarity of vision to do the right thing. One assumes people are inherently good and want the best for everyone, and one assumes people are inherently selfish and only out for number one. It's the perfect encapsulation of Superman's philosophy, an idea repeated and reworked over and over in numerous Superman adventures. It suggests that ruling with an iron fist doesn't change people's hearts and minds for the better, it only forces the world you want to live in for as long as you can keep your power, but leading by example and showing that a person with immense power has it within himself to use that power selflessly can maybe move people to be better than they ever thought possible. And if everyone did that, the world becomes a better place, and it's sustainable for as long as people choose to allow it to be. I like that that story only shows that the opposite of Superman's worldview doesn't work. It doesn't suggest a definite happy ending. We never get to see what Jor-El's influence would have been on the planet had his people listened to him and it hadn't been destroyed. So Superman himself is a part of this story, the hope for the future, but a sober one that recognizes that his goals have never been achieved before, but is optimistic that through his example, they could be. My favorite version of this story is a novel called The Last Days of Krypton, written by Kevin J. Anderson, which I think, so far, weaves the most complex and layered relationship between Jor-El and Zod, and some of the most creative and plausible explanations for a lot of the staples of the origin, like how and why Krypton explodes, and why Jor-El and Laura don't come with their baby to Earth. This is really different from his version, and there's a lot of stuff we don't know and that doesn't totally make sense about the history and the politics. But one of the reasons I loved Man of Steel initially was because of how much of what I admired from that book was there. Jor-El and Zod used to be friends, they both have great respect for each other, they both want to save their race, but they have fundamentally different ideologies that lead them to vehemently despising the other solution. It is a Krypton that destroys itself, and it's a culture that has tragically allowed itself to stagnate and decay. Regardless of how effectively these ideas are used in the larger narrative, I love this classic sci-fi premise. It's heavily inspired by Brave New World and borrows appropriately from John Byrne's Man of Steel. These Kryptonians mastered their harsh environment but played God and didn't respect nature. They were so obsessed with controlling their own nature that they hollowed themselves out the same way they hollowed out their planet's core. Those imperfections are part of our uniqueness, and if you try to eradicate all of them, you take away the struggle for self-improvement, which is arguably the main thing that makes us human. Or Kryptonian. Human, Kryptonian, self-aware mammals that might look like Henry Cavill regardless of what planet they're born on. So by the time Krypton explodes, these people are arguably hardly people at all, but rather biological machines programmed to fulfill a certain function in society. It's left ambiguous as to how much free will any of them really have, or whether they're still capable of exerting their own individuality and going against whatever society intends for them. It's never specifically stated they're wired to do exactly exactly what they do, but Jor-El certainly implies that when he tells Clark that his people eliminated the possibility of choice. So Jor-El creates an argument for freedom and individuality as necessary for an intelligent race's survival. And with the exception of those bred to protect their race, this dilution of free will seems to almost eliminate the survival instinct. As the Council is so predisposed to uphold tradition, they're lacking in basic common sense. Unless, of course, they're just dumbed down so we can have the classic situation of an idiotic government that doesn't believe Jor-El when he says they're doomed. How can anyone with a 5th grade education not realize that if you harvest your planet's core, you're gonna render your world uninhabitable? This is why Jor-El and Lara don't go with their son to Earth. They're part of this doomed system that has perverted their nature and made their destruction inevitable. All this talk about choice versus predestination, I could go on about this for a while, but I'm just going to touch on it. There is so much Matrix in this movie. The story itself isn't practically beat for beat the Matrix like Constantine, but we've got people who are born rather than grown. The Genesis chamber looks almost exactly like the maturation chamber in the Matrix, just as the squid-like armored tentacle security system thingy looks like the machines that attack Morpheus' ship. And Morpheus himself is here, except Perry White is kind of the opposite of Morpheus, trying to hide the truth from the people because they aren't ready for it rather than working to free people's minds. But that crabby general guy who hates Morpheus is here, and he's exactly the same character without a love triangle. And of course, this and the Matrix are borrowing from some of the same material. Thematically, they both deal with the idea that society might fall apart if people don't have to make their own decisions. What's most fascinating to me is that if it's true the Kryptonians only do whatever they were designed to, then Jor-El doesn't have any more choice in his actions than Zod does. They're a little like Professor Xavier and Magneto in X-Men First Class, in that they both appear to want the same thing, but they really don't. As Zod says, the only thing they agree on is that Krypton is doomed. They both want to save it, but what that means is different for each of them. Jor-El, a scientist designed to find answers in the natural world, wants to save what Krypton once was and what it should be. While Zod, a military man designed to protect the status quo, wants to save what Krypton is now. Zod's goals are fundamentally flawed, because he doesn't recognize that the system he's so desperate to perpetuate is the reason they're screwed. The inherent optimism in Jor-El's logic is that he comes to it empirically. His own programming leads him to believe that allowing people to choose for themselves is the only way for an intelligent species to prosper. It's a loophole in the design that leads a man created by artificial means to help keep this ostensibly perfected but clearly decaying culture alive by allowing the imperfections that allowed his race to thrive thousands of years ago. And perhaps it's even nature's way of reasserting itself after being repressed all this time. As Ian Malcolm says in Jurassic Park, life, finds a way. I kind of resisted the idea that Krypton would even have scientists anymore at first, since they're afraid of change and don't allow any sort of innovation that would threaten their way of life. But I can see why they'd decide it was necessary, out of desperation, to go to science for answers to come up with new ways to prolong their lifespan since they've depleted their resources. I have to assume that Kryptonians are genetically predisposed to have no desire to procreate, since they still physically have the ability to have children naturally. Otherwise, Kryptonians would be committing heresy all the time. And we're told Kal-El is the first natural birth in thousands of years. So unless Jor-El is conveniently the first genetically engineered Kryptonian to develop a sense of free will or a sex drive just a few decades before the planet explodes, his own artificial nature leads him to this conclusion, just as Zod's nature leads him to try to take over the planet and commit atrocities in the name of saving his people. Both of those plans are kind of lacking in sense by the end, but I love it conceptually. So all the inherent questions about what makes a man in the way Krypton ends informs what Superman will ultimately stand for. I really like the idea that Krypton is a cautionary tale that Superman would use to lead humanity on a path away from its own destruction. We have that to a degree in Donner's movie, but I like this emphasis on choice as a natural gift the Kryptonians took for granted. Superman is given a mission by Jor-El he can choose to accept or ignore. Unlike the societal role embedded in Jor-El's DNA, he had no choice in. It's an immense responsibility and an enormous burden for anyone, but he's the embodiment of the idea that every person has to face that choice to some degree, to use what power you have to make the world a better place, or to accept the status quo, embrace apathy, and do nothing. It's that Joss Whedon idea that a person's destiny is really just a sense of responsibility. It's not divine will, but something you can actually choose to turn away from. But by doing the right thing, you become a better person, and that improves the world around you. Unfortunately, a lot of this is compacted into that first 15 minutes, and it's hard to process the grander ideas while trying to play catch-up. It's exhausting to follow that opening scene. There's so much plotting and scheming and philosophizing and politics and lore and character motivations to keep track of, and fighting and betrayal and death, and somebody should have told me to bring a pad of paper so I could keep notes. In Manus Race, great, and thanks for not spoon-feeding me a lot of forced exposition and dialogue, but throw me some kind of a bone here. It's like I walked into an epic Krypton movie right in the middle of the climax and then stayed for the sequel, and I find myself yearning for the first hour and 45 minutes of Jor-El's movie while I'm watching the not nearly as interesting and sometimes off-putting Superman stuff, which is not at all how you want to feel watching a movie called Man of Steel, which, by the way, as a title, isn't like The Dark Knight and actually has something to do with what the story's about. I actually think Last Son of Krypton would have been more fitting, since the alien heritage is at the forefront both in plotting and thematically, and although Superman isn't the only Kryptonian through most of the movie, that would be a really fitting title by the end. I could see the argument that because the Kryptonians can't really help who they are and what they do, a whole movie about them would be 2 hours of non-entities doing stuff. But to the credit of both the screenplay and Crow and Shannon's acting, I am invested enough in both Jor-El and Zod that I want to know more about them. And after all, isn't whether or not we truly have choice or we're all acting according to our own, at least, individual natures always the question? I like that by the end, I'm not completely sure if Zod couldn't have changed if he really wanted to. When Superman destroys his dream of a new Krypton by crashing his ship and incinerating the Genesis chamber, he says, "My soul, that is what you have taken from me." That's a great line, and I could have used more like it. Does Zod have a soul? Or does he only have a sense of purpose? There especially should have been some talk about this toward the end, given Superman's catch-22 where he decides he has no choice but to kill Zod. Did he take down a monster, like he does in the comics, when he and Doomsday kill each other? Or did he kill essentially another human being? And of course, if you think Zod isn't less than human, it's up to you to decide if Superman should have let him murder people until he found another way to take him down, or if you even buy that it really was the Catch-22 it's played as. I'll break that down in excruciating detail later on. But whether or not Jor-El and Zod have in them whatever it is that makes us human, they're potentially fascinating characters either way, and I want to spend more time with them. And side note, I'm kind of amused by the unintentional implications of putting the pictographs of a doomed and stagnated culture that's afraid of change and keeps regurgitating the same things over and over on the Warner Brothers logo in an age where so many movies are cash-ins on name recognition. And given Warner's own track record of being afraid to take risks with these very DC properties, they seem to be maybe moving away from that mentality right now, but in 2013, not so long after the very formulaic and by-the-numbers Green Lantern, that is quite an image. There's a lot about the Krypton stuff that's left out, and that makes it hard to do anything with the themes I'm discussing, beyond making observations and postulating what might be going on under particular circumstances were we given more information. It's an absolute nightmare to try to analyze, try as I might. When Clark meets Jor-El's interactive voicemail machine that dramatically makes Clark chase him down hallways for no good reason, he tells Jor-El that he has so many questions. Yeah, me too. And I kind of thought that scene might answer more of them instead of leaving me asking so many more. What should be a really illuminating expository sequence instead catches Clark up on things we know already and explains other things we might have guessed without giving any concrete reasons for them. And remember, Krypton is dead. Jor-El has absolutely no reason whatsoever to be cryptic or withhold information from Clark. But there are big chunks of this conversation that seem to be missing, like Jor-El isn't even naturally moving from one point to another sometimes. He tells Clark that Krypton prospered for 100,000 years, inventing and traveling the stars and establishing outposts, and then inexplicably, artificial population control was established. Wait, what? I think you skipped a chapter. Why? Did some horrible catastrophe happen? Was the planet grossly overpopulated? But then you had a good solution for that, outposts on other planets. And why isn't Clark asking these questions? I mean, he has so many of them, but I guess why the Kryptonians ruined their planet by removing their own free will wasn't one of them. This guy used to be a thinker when he was a kid, or so we're led to believe. Maybe he was just skimming Plato for a homework assignment when he dealt with those bullies outside the Smallville TV show reference garage. And although the Blu-ray commentary makes it clear that this was supposed to be a species with a lot of hubris dating all the way back to their origins that might have gradually led them down this tragic path, Drell makes it sound like a sudden change in thinking. They were expansionists and thrived on new ideas, and then they did a 180 and became isolationists who were terrified of change. What happened? And come to think of it, what was Lara's role in Kryptonian society? Surely it wasn't housewife. What was she predisposed to do that led her to decide with Jor-El to break thousands of years of tradition and commit an act of sacrilege by having a child naturally? Wow, lucky break, Jor-El. You might have found the only woman on the whole planet who would sleep with you. All we really know about her is that she seems to have a motherly instinct and is sad she won't get to see her son grow up. But these Kryptonians aren't built to be parents, at least not naturally. And I suppose she could have been bred to raise babies when they came out of the Genesis chamber. We aren't told anything about who takes care of the children, but in the commentary, I think it's Russell Crowe who mentions that couples are supposed to apply for a child and their blueprints are taken from the Codex and put into the Genesis chamber whenever society is in need for people to fill certain roles. That would also help to explain why people who don't procreate even get married. But again, it's in the commentary, but not in the movie. And while I'm here, and this one is really nitpicky, but why is the Codex a creepy black skull? Is it the skull of a real dead Kryptonian? Whose skull is it? How was that person chosen to have all these future Kryptonians' DNA put into what's left of his head? And how does that work anyway? Jor-El says the Codex is the pattern of every unborn Kryptonian. Until the end of time? Like, endless generations forever? All in a skull? Man, that's planning ahead. At some point, I just have to chalk all this up to, we needed a MacGuffin for Zod to go after, and a skull looked cool, and making the hero himself the MacGuffin seemed like a novel idea that might mask that it's yet another bad guy trying to get his hands on some elusive artifact plot. But at least the artifact is something Zod needs to accomplish a specific goal that's all about who he is and what he wants, and it's not a generic ultimate power sort of villain plot. I mean, that's what's so frustrating about how sloppy a lot of this is. There's a real effort to turn some standard superhero tropes on their heads and get away from standard formulas. On paper, the idea of putting the entire Kryptonian civilization inside Superman so he's literally the last great hope for both Krypton and Earth has potential. But it gets real convoluted real fast. At the end of the day, Jor-El and Zod both have really head-scratching plans. If any of this makes more sense to you, by all means, take me to school in the comments. What exactly does Jor-El expect Clark to do with the Codex when he grows up, if anything? Jor-El's hologram talks about cohabitation with Zod, and he talks to Clark about being a bridge between two peoples. But he doesn't even tell Clark about the Codex initially, just tells him to push his limits, gives him a costume that's somehow on an 18,000-year-old spaceship, and maybe it's got a replicator, I don't know, and puts him on the path to become a superhero. It's only after they board Zod's ship that he starts talking about coexistence. He says he wanted to wait until Superman knew what it meant to be human, but he still never tells him what he's supposed to do with the Codex, or even that it's inside his body. I'm not sure Superman ever even realizes that's where Zod got the genetic material to build the Genesis chamber. Or, come to think of it, if he realizes the full implications of his crashing Zod's ship. Zod tells him if the ship goes down, Krypton's future goes with it. He hesitates for only a second, and then makes the moral judgment call to destroy probably thousands of alien embryos, rather than trying to figure out a way to save them and stop Zod, and be the bridge between two peoples that Jor-El talked about. But I don't know if he realizes that's what he's doing. If he does, that's perhaps a lot more morally ambiguous than killing Zod to save some people he's trying to kill. In both instances, you can make the case that the Kryptonians are machines before they're people. But I wouldn't be comfortable making that call myself in 1 second. Zod wants to commit genocide, but isn't this bordering genocide? But I don't have enough information to blame Clark before I blame Jor-El. As far as I can tell, Superman doesn't have the faintest idea what Zod's talking about, because Jor-El withholds vital information that is necessary to whatever it is he meant for his son to do on Earth in the first place. One of two things is going on here, and neither of them makes any sense to me. One, it's a really elaborate symbolic gesture. Jor-El never intended on his son doing anything with the Codex or even knowing about it, but his leading humanity down a better road with Krypton sort of living on inside of him represents hope for the future. And when he says he wanted to wait until Clark knew what it meant to be human, he's not talking about doing anything with the Codex, just going off and being a superhero. Which basically means he risks life and limb for the audience's benefit, so the movie looks all thematically deep and stuff. This is Jor-El's solution to the survival of his race over Zod's plan to keep trying to delay what he thinks is inevitable. So I don't think he'd try to save the Codex just to be theatrical. The second, and only other possibility I see, is that Jor-El intends for Clark to use the Codex, set up a Genesis chamber, and unleash upon the Earth a whole race of programmed Kryptonians, all with a specific purpose for a dead world that no longer applies and who all have awesome godlike powers. But he wouldn't do that because, again, Jor-El thinks Krypton doomed itself long ago by removing the power of choice from their genetic makeup. And that's the whole reason he and his wife choose to die along with their planet. He didn't think any living Kryptonian except a natural-born one was part of the solution. So even this talk about cohabitation seems at odds with his whole stance on what was wrong with their civilization in the first place. Unless I'm totally off base on this genetic programming business and Jor-El is just talking about societal influence when he says he and Lara are part of this doomed system. But let's assume Jor-El actually put the Codex in Clark for a reason and expected him to do something with it at some point. Well, first, Clark would have to find out about his origins and that the Codex is inside him. Unlike most other versions of the character I've seen, Jor-El doesn't do anything to make sure Clark will ever find out about his heritage. The Christopher Reeve version had a crystal that glows and makes weird noises and gives you an indication you're supposed to do something with it at least. If you threw it in the snow, poof, Fortress of Solitude. Then the interactive Jor-El wiki trains him and tells him all about anything he wants to know. But this is a little more like how Clark discovers Jor-El and Krypton in Smallville, built on a series of really unlikely coincidences, rather than Jor-El doing anything to make sure Clark goes where he'd have to go to ever activate a Kryptonian key. In Smallville, he conveniently falls into a cave with a slot where the key goes. Here, he wanders around until somebody just happens to mention that a thousands-year-old spacecraft just happened to be found now. Smallville's cave, and then having a fortress later, was always silly and convoluted, but somehow this strikes me as even more ridiculous. Jor-El sent the key, yeah, another key, although this one's more like a thumb drive, and he took the time to imprint his consciousness into it. So I think it's safe to assume he planned on Clark finding out about his heritage. But what did Jor-El expect Clark to do with the thumb drive? Presumably he somehow knew that crashed ship was there, or I really don't know what he thought Clark was going to do with the key. But he does nothing to even point Clark in its general direction. Clark just gets lucky that that ship gets unearthed right then. I thought the way Peter Parker gets bitten by the spider in The Amazing Spider-Man was contrived. That looks like the most likely scenario next to this. At least that hero's dad left him some clues. This one does nothing. Even in Smallville, Jor-El gave the kid more to go on. Sure, there had to be a brilliant scientist that had discovered how to read the Kryptonian language, and even once he knows what it says, the instructions on the inside of the ship are hidden, cryptic, and then mortifying. But at least they're there. Maybe the idea is supposed to be that the key somehow leads Clark to the ship, but there's no indication of that beyond how totally unbelievable it is that he gets there just hitchhiking and overhearing a conversation at a bar. I could see some logic to the key sending him to that ship when he reached a certain age, maybe with a high-pitched whine that calls him to the ship like the key in Smallville does. But even if I had a single sliver of evidence that's what's going on, it's still ridiculous that people just happen to find that ship buried in ice now. Heck, why isn't there more shock, awe, and wonder about all this alien stuff in general? We have a spaceship, a man who can fly, and people don't seem remotely fazed by any of this. Richard Schiff says in the commentary that he suggested to Snyder a moment right before his character, Dr. Emil Hamilton, pushes in the key to stop Zod's plan, where he looks at this incredible alien technology in amazement and quietly says, "Wow," just before he dies, or gets sucked into the Phantom Zone. I'm actually not sure if he survives or not. But Schiff says Snyder didn't go for it. But we need those sorts of moments to feel like we're watching real people instead of plot devices. And now that I'm thinking about it, why isn't Clark remotely curious about how the scout ship wound up there? Again, he just skips over the interesting stuff and barely elaborates on things we know already. Maybe this is why a lot of people aren't getting behind the Superman. He doesn't respond to things like any sensible, thoughtful, curious person would. Jor-El says it was one of a bunch of scout ships that was sent out to colonize. Okay, but what happened? I mean, sure, I like how mysterious it is, and it's a fun reworking of the fortress, except it flies away before Clark has the chance to learn any more than Jor-El's Cliff's Notes history of Krypton with several pages ripped out, but there's leaving things that aren't vital to the story up to the audience's imagination, and there's also allowing them to piece things together they can see with their own two eyes. And then there's just throwing a spaceship under ice and hoping we'll read the tie-in comic that explains this is how we get Supergirl in this universe. There's supposed to be more movies. Fine, so establishing things you might pay off later is cool. But if I were Clark, I'd be asking the exposition box some questions about it. Had Kryptonians been here before? Did they come later? Jor-El knows some things about the planet. Is that because of prior scout missions? Did the pods not open when the ship crashed, and so all the Kryptonians died before they had a chance to experience the weird combination of Earth's atmosphere and the yellow sun that apparently gives them their powers in this universe? Which apparently you still get as long as you're walking around in the air, even if you're breathing Kryptonian air, but that get weaker if you're exposed to sunlight, but in a Kryptonian atmosphere, but that's a whole other thing I'm not even going to get into. Was there a Kryptonian that lived on Earth after this, way back then, or was that pod open because the ship was disturbed now? Again, I know there's a comic that explains all this, but Clark didn't pick up a copy of that book last Wednesday, as far as I know. So anyway, without divine intervention from the screenwriting gods, the odds of Clark ever learning what his heritage was seem astronomical. Given his father's warnings about keeping his powers a secret, and the fact that Clark let him die to protect them, if he'd never gone to that bar, he probably would have just wandered around aimlessly forever, looking for that elusive, whatever special thing according to Jonathan's gut feeling he was supposed to find that would magically make it okay for him to start using his powers to help people. If that was even the reason he was traveling. If I were Clark, I'd be angry with Jor-El. By not giving him any way to learn about Krypton and why he was sent there earlier, his adoptive father died needlessly. Well, he died needlessly anyway, but I'll get to that in a second. Again, Jor-El has that throwaway line about waiting until Clark had lived the human experience, but that's not until their second encounter. If it were me, I think I'd say, hey, wait a minute, if I was wearing this costume a few years ago, my dad might still be alive. This is the reason I was sent here that he wanted me to wait for. And it's easy not to think of that watching the movie because we don't know that Clark let his dad die until after their first meeting. Jor-El doesn't seem to have any plan beyond hoping Clark would find something to stick that key into somewhere. It's kind of like he, read the script, but instead of feeling anything about any of this, Clark's just happy to have someone validate his natural instinct to help people. And I do like that. Some of the movie's optimism comes from the idea that people are innately compassionate. But a digital ghost of his birth father gives him a suit and tells him his purpose really was to go save people, and now he's not worried at all that someone might find out who he is, like he has been all this time. Well, perhaps he got the suit, flew around, and then would have just put it away and never gotten it back out again if it weren't for Zod. Man, it's a good thing Zod came out of the Phantom Zone and heard that beacon, or Clark might have met Jor-El and still not become Superman. Oh well, at least we don't have a spaceship that heals people. And at least this Jor-El isn't a godlike maniac who can manipulate time and space and kidnap a teenager, stick her in a wall for a decade, and brainwash her to think she's Clark's Kryptonian cousin. I guess all these questions are just things I'm going to have to ask that version of Jor-El when I get to heaven. So now let's talk about Zod's plan, which isn't incomprehensible like Jor-El's, but is just ignoring a lot of basic logic to try to raise the stakes. I at least understand why Zod's doing what he's doing, but a lot of it doesn't seem necessary or even the smartest way to achieve his goals. And I hate that it makes him a little less sympathetic. Although replacing Terrence Stamp's kneel before Zod with I will find him is lame and unintentionally as funny as anything Bane says in The Dark Knight Rises, I like that he's a totally different character with understandable motivations. And you almost can't fault him for anything he does because of that question of whether or not he has a human soul. He is contrasted with Clark, not innately compassionate, maybe because he was designed that way. But what he wants doesn't require genocide. He gets knocked out of the Phantom Zone because the planet explodes. however that works, and then he and his soldiers manage to convert a Phantom Zone projector into a space drive. Wow, it's a good thing Zod got one of the militant scientists the ancient Kryptonians threw in the Codex for a rainy day, I guess. They find the old abandoned Kryptonian outpost and discover a world engine, which Zod brings with him to Earth, planning to terraform it to be more like Krypton. Now, I'm fine with his going to Earth in the first place. He needs the Codex to repopulate whatever world he's going to transform into New Krypton, and he thinks it's in Kal-El's ship. Maybe Lara should have let him think it was still on Krypton, which is about to explode, by the way, but I guess everybody in movies divulges information they wouldn't usually share when they think you're about to die or be sent to a black hole prison. And I even like that Zod doesn't care about having superpowers. He and his people would be gods on Earth. They could rule over everyone if they didn't make it more like Krypton, but then it wouldn't be Krypton, and that's what he was built to preserve. This isn't the power-hungry, arrogant Zod that wants everyone to bow down to him. This is about an ingrained belief system of control. Zod, I see you are practiced in worshipping things that die. My point is that it isn't until Superman has already destroyed the world engine and Zod's people have been sucked into the Phantom Zone that Zod turns into a revenge-seeking villain. Before that, all he cares about is saving his race. So the $64,000 question, why does New Krypton have to be Earth? And if you could build it somewhere else, why risk putting it on the one planet with a guy that has all your powers and has had the time to get good at using them? The only possible reasons to resort to killing an entire species so yours can live exactly like they used to is either because you want to hurt Superman where he lives, or you're lazy and you're here already. Well, Zod doesn't really have a vendetta against Superman yet, although there's a perfectly good one that could have been built in. Superman's father betrayed Zod. He seems to think he could have saved the planet if he hadn't been sent to the Phantom Zone, and he called Superman's birth heresy. For Zod, this guy is a perversion of everything Kryptonians are supposed to be. But none of that ever comes up. So he's terraforming Earth because it's a planet they can use, and the movie needs an impetus for its typical kill everyone, drop buildings, people running, and pretend like we care about somebody who's gonna die we've spent no time with at all sort of climax. That would be one of those places where we're really not getting away from the expected superhero movie tropes. Why doesn't Zod just go back to the planet where he found the world engine? He has the power to make it or any other planet suitable. He has the Genesis weapon from Wrath of Khan, essentially. And once he extracts the Codex from Superman, he has a viable Genesis chamber. He's got Genesis twice! If this were 1992, Sega would have bought so much product placement, right along with Nikon and its 3DS. I mean, D3S. Zod also has a phantom drive and can go anywhere he wants through black holes. It wouldn't take him any time at all to find a planet big enough and close enough to a sun to make a new Krypton. Now, maybe you can chalk up everything that doesn't make sense about both Zod and Jor-El to screwed up genetics. But you know whose point of view is just as perplexing and doesn't have that excuse? Jonathan Kent. Kevin Costner turns in a fantastic performance, and there's not an actor alive better suited for that role. I can't tell you my level of giddiness when that choice was announced. I grew up on Field of Dreams. He's a Midwestern farmer in that movie, and it's... Wait a minute. I just figured out who the voice is in Field of Dreams. You know, if you build it, he will come, go the distance. It's Jor-El from Smallville. I've tried, and I just don't see where he's coming from. There's a lot of trying to set this continuity apart from other Superman things, and I like some of that. It watches like an Elseworld Superman story, playing with your expectations because Superman's story is so universally known. It bugs me when Snyder says in the commentary that he tried to approach this like no one had ever made a Superman movie before, because when it's really working for me, it's because I'm familiar with what came before and enjoying how he's subverting it. And I think it's banking on its viewers having at least a base knowledge of what Superman's all about, because it feels like it's asking us to trust it, that even though he starts from a really different place, he's gonna become that symbol of hope we hope he'll be. Sometimes it's clever or inspired, like the way Clark and Lois meet, and the way it shakes up that standard dynamic by ending the film with Clark and Lois meeting in the Daily Planet for the first time, but her not only knowing him already, but being his only confidant. And wow, Amy Adams has really come up in the world after all those kryptonite diet shakes. I really enjoyed how unpredictable and fresh all that was, and it's not for no reason, as Lois represents Clark's newfound hope in the potential altruism of mankind, and is ultimately the reason he takes his first steps toward becoming, hopefully, the shining example of truth and justice we know him as. As he falls in love with Lois, he falls in love with humanity. I wish that was more at the fore, and I like their relationship and chemistry and everything they go through that gets them there, but it's not on screen nearly enough and it kind of gets lost in the shuffle. And also, introducing the whole world to Kal-El before he's Superman is really interesting, making it harder for him to gain people's trust right away because he's been secretly living among them all this time and looks like an unnecessary liability for bringing his birth world's problems to Earth, regardless of not being remotely at fault for it. It's a bad first impression, and if you want to do a modern take where people are more likely to be suspicious of Superman just because of his power set than in previous screen versions, I like that there are also some solid, logical reasons from the beginning that people might be afraid of him. After all, as Lois proves, not everyone fears what they don't understand, like Jonathan believes. And I like that it's more complicated than that. But then some of those changes feel like it's just trying too hard. Like when it tries to set itself apart from the first Donner film by taking what's sort of the movie's second act and sprinkling it awkwardly throughout the movie as a non-linear series of flashbacks that interrupt the narrative and make the pacing uneven before they really inform the scene they're set before or butting in the middle of. Maybe it's also trying to do the non-linear Batman Begins thing, but there it felt necessary, like we were experiencing moments in Bruce's past when we really needed them. It was also more subtle about it and moved away from it after the first act. Jonathan Kent himself is one of those changes for the sake of change. I don't know if Goyer or anyone else really thinks that salt-of-the-earth parents with traditional Midwestern values just don't exist anymore, and I think it's more likely that this was just an attempt to make Clark's life harder to appease people who think the character is usually too perfect. So instead of the solid moral upbringing that compels Clark to always act selflessly, he has scared parents that teach him not to use his powers and to even sacrifice human beings in the moment so he'll be unencumbered when he's ready to save a lot more later. There are attempts to smooth this over and make that position more sympathetic, like the really awfully constructed exchange between Clark and Martha on the steps when she tells him they always thought the truth about him was beautiful. But it's a really extreme position, and it's not handled with nearly the care it needs to be to bring me on board with it. The way everybody in the commentary talks about Clark's parents, it's like they're the same model parents we're used to, and like Clark still gets his values from them. But that's not really the movie I'm watching. John Schneider's Jonathan Kent would tell his son to be careful, but also would often say, "I can't stop you," when he knew Clark was risking himself to do the right thing, and he was always immensely proud of his son for that. And forgive me if my outlook is more positive than yours, but that never struck me as too idealistic or sappy or unbelievable. That always seemed normal. How does any regular Joe raising his kid and doing his best not swell up with pride when his son saves a guy from drowning? Or when he runs 400 miles to talk to a doctor who might be able to save a kid with a terminal brain tumor? These Kents strike me more like the parents of a lot of cryptofreaks. And honestly, that's fine if I didn't distrust its intentions with this so much. I could be led to believe this version too, but of course, you'd have to work a lot harder to convince me your Superman develops the values and willpower to create the Superman ideal somewhere else and long after he was raised. Here, Jonathan looks like a misguided father who is understandably afraid to let his son ever use his powers in public, but he accidentally raises his son to be suspicious and distrusting of people. Clark feels alone and ostracized through most of his life, and it isn't until Lois has a chance to professionally profit at his expense, and doesn't, and puts herself in scalding hot water with the government, that he decides to definitively trust humanity and put himself in their hands, or at least in the hands of the US government. But there's never any discussion about whether Jonathan was right or wrong. He's wrong in that someone proved people wouldn't all react to Clark in fear or for their own gain, but it never comes down on Jonathan's actions as good or bad. Jor-El wants Clark to act, and Jonathan wants him to wait, at least until some vague, undefined time, as the world is ready for him to act. Get rid of that nonsense, and it works a lot better. We could have had a really interesting moral argument between Jor-El and Jonathan, two father figures pulling him in opposite directions, a clear optimism versus pessimism debate. That would be almost the flip of Thomas Wayne and Ra's al Ghul in Begins. In this case, you'd have a Clark that went against the father who raised him in order to be the better man instead of the other way around. Although both men would still be going with their biological fathers. That's interesting. But I'm getting off track. If Jonathan could actually see the future, he has a compelling argument. If he knew that Clark was going to grow up and be this hero the world needs unless he's found out, you could make the argument that the good of the many outweighs the good of the few. That's not the traditional Superman morality, and purists would hate that the movie even went there, but there's an argument. I'm not even going to tackle the ends justifies the means versus value ethics debate, because Jonathan isn't really a character in this movie, and not the same way Zod and Jor-El could be said to be non-people. He's a plot-driven playing piece informed too much by the icon the movie knows Clark is supposed to be. What has to happen for the world to be ready? When is Clark supposed to know it's time to, as Jonathan says, stand in front of the human race? Jonathan must have gotten the script from the same person who mailed it to Jor-El. And the bit at the end, with Jonathan seeing a young Clark wearing a Superman cape, plays like it's kind of paying this all off? Maybe? Martha says, "Believe me, Clark, he saw it." I don't know if that's supposed to be some vision, like Jonathan sees that and somehow knows the hero Clark will become, and that's what really forms his don't save people, not even me policy, or if it's simply supposed to demonstrate that Clark always had the heart of a hero. But it adds to my confusion as to whether the movie expects me to see Jonathan as a hero or as the basis for a tragic backstory. And I don't understand where he's coming from enough to make a decision on my own. Also, it's pretty convenient that Clark as a little boy puts on a red cape in a world that hasn't been influenced by Superman as a fictional character, and given that later on, neither Superman or what any part of the costume looks like is going to be his idea. I do kind of like the scene where Jonathan tells a teenage Clark after a confrontation with a bully that he'll have to decide what sort of man he's going to be, implying that showing restraint isn't just about making sure no one finds out about him, but because if he wants to be a good man, he has a responsibility not to give in to his anger. I also like that Jonathan takes a bit of a risk there, and lets Clark handle that on his own, despite his fears. Clark can't learn to do the right thing if his father is always stepping in. But man, that tornado scene is one of the most contrived situations I have ever seen in a movie. Now, first off, let me get the important stuff out of the way. A, I don't buy this Clark would let his father die, especially after they just conveniently had this really forced, intense conversation about his wanting to do more with his life than farming. He's starting to rebel against his dad hard, and the scene plays like this is Jonathan's chance to prove he's right. He's setting the example. He's making the sacrifice, just as Superman will be willing to make a sacrifice at the end of the movie, even though it doesn't end up coming to that, as the constant barrage of Jesus imagery and obvious parallels keeps slapping us in the face with. Yes, he's trying to save a world that has forsaken him, and that's like Jesus. We get it. But what about the situation finally opens Clark's eyes? Clark who always defies his father and risks his secret coming out to help people. And Clark who will continue to do that after his father dies. And B, how big of a risk to his secret is this really? I realize this is a slowed moment in time, and he might not have a lot of time to think all this through, but his dad's gonna die, trying to save a dog. Nobody seems to have their phones out filming, and even if someone happens to get this on video, it's bound to be blurry and hard to make out in this weather. And no one's gonna believe even a crowd full of people in the middle of a tornado when they say they saw Clark rip the roof off this car, any more than anybody believed Pete Ross's mom about the bus. But it's just a really manufactured and silly scenario that's supposed to be super sad and inform who this Clark is. And I don't buy one element about it. It's trying to turn another major classic Superman scene on its head. His father dies in the original Donner film as well, of a heart attack, and that's all about Clark learning his limitations and that with all his abilities, he can't save everyone. It's an important life lesson. There's nothing contrived about it. It's simple, it's poignant. But here, he could have saved his father, and what limits him is ostensibly the greater good. This is the biggest thing that prevents me from truly understanding Clark and what he's going through, because beyond screaming in the moment, I don't really know how he feels about this. Again, he doesn't stop saving people, as Lois says that's not an option for him. So that upbringing certainly explains his loneliness and why he isn't sure he should trust anyone. But we've got a Superman here with almost as tragic a backstory as Batman. I mean, his dad isn't murdered in an alley, but he could have stopped it. And his dad, as far as Clark can tell, died a totally senseless death. Bruce felt guilty about his parents' deaths in Batman Begins, and all he did was get scared, ask his parents to leave the opera, and his dad was too polite to go out the safer door. I could totally see this Superman receding into himself, totally unable to forgive himself, and refusing to help anyone because if he does, he's dishonoring what his father died for. I'm not saying that's the only direction that makes any sense, but I need him to talk about how he feels beyond explaining what his father died for at his grave to Lois. And like a lot of scenes, that one feels clipped up and it ends abruptly. I constantly have this sinking suspicion that Cavill's Superman isn't really as monosyllabic as Brandon Routh's, but that Snyder is gutting a lot of talking stuff for fighting stuff. Because, of course, all we're really here for is that big brawl at the end. Why didn't Snyder just make a 2-hour live-action Fleischer cartoon? That would have been awesome. He wouldn't need any lines past "this looks like a job for Superman," and the story could be super simple and also totally cohesive. Now forget about all that stuff, close your eyes, and take a moment to consider how terrible an example this movie is setting for having a farmer who's lived his whole life in the tornado capital of the world to tell a whole crowd of people to go under an overpass during a tornado. I never thought I'd see another idiot from Kansas in a Superman thing set in Smallville do the exact opposite thing you're supposed to do when you're in a tornado. As discussed on Counting Cryptofreaks in the last episode of the first season of Smallville, Tempest, Lana is looking at 3 tornadoes that touch down and create one monster tornado. She's standing right next to a ditch, and what does she do? She gets back in the truck, and naturally gets sucked up into the tornado. That girl shouldn't have a driver's license, much less be allowed to run a coffee shop. But this is easily as stupid. From LiveScience.com. Myth. When you're on the road, the best place to ride out a tornado is under a bridge, otherwise known as an overpass. Definitely not. Do not do this. Although it might seem like the bridge over your head would protect you, hiding under an overpass or bridge is actually very dangerous, because the tornado's winds can blast debris underneath the structure. The storm's winds could blow you out from underneath and possibly into the tornado itself, or the bridge could collapse on top of you. But if you're on the road, you don't want to stay in your car either. Vehicles are notorious as death traps in tornadoes because they're easily tossed and destroyed. Your options depend on where the tornado is and what's around you. If the tornado is far away or not heading toward you, the best option may be to head in the opposite direction and get out of its path. Yeah, head in the opposite direction. Yeah, that tornado forms faster than any tornado in history, but it's not going to catch up to him if he's driving 80 miles an hour. It's hard to wonder if Jonathan hasn't just let the pressure get to him to the point where he's got a death wish. Pile all this up, and you've got a paranoid farmer who tells his son maybe he should let a bus full of kids die rather than let anyone find out about his superpowers, because he watched his kid run around in a red cape once and realized he was destined for some sort of greatness that the world would someday suddenly somehow be ready for. And he thinks overpasses are safe places to hide from tornadoes. I think finding a spaceship with a baby in it knocked a few screws loose. If Clark had saved him, he would have gotten up the next day, plowed under his corn, and built a baseball diamond, as the voice of Smallville Jor-El commanded, where this movie's Zod and Jor-El would one day come and play baseball, because as Jor-El says, they're both ghosts. Hey, is this Krypton? No, it's Iowa. What's really weird, too, is how much research Snyder and his crew did to make their Smallville look really authentic. And I live in Kansas. I'm from right around where Smallville and the TV show seems to be located. And I was floored by how well they nailed the look. It's like they went out of their way to make the TV show look as silly as it is. With a population of 45,000, they pretend is a really tiny town with all those citizens with Vancouver accents. We have so many IHOPs around here. And Clark's wearing a Royals t-shirt in a creepy mind probe hallucination. That's awesome. And then the Royals went off and won the World Series 2 years later. I can't imagine if this movie came out this year. Out here, the opening night crowd would have lost it. But how do you get the look and feel of the Midwest so right and you make that mistake? So now that you've had a chance to order a pizza, eat said pizza, and take 2 bathroom breaks, let's finally talk a little bit about Superman himself, who's getting almost as lost in this review as he is in the movie. The only thing anybody was talking about after this movie came out was, should Superman kill Zod? Or I suppose more often the argument was, should the movie have had the audacity to have Superman kill Zod? But before we can really get into that, we need to talk about whether or not this guy is really actually Superman yet. He's wearing the costume through a good chunk of the movie, but it's a fair question, because A, as we've discussed, this Clark goes down a very unconventional road. that runs through an overpass. And B, we have that Casino Royale scene at the end, and a lot of reboot origins do this now. The big payoff moment where the guy who isn't what you're used to finally steps into the familiar shoes we hoped he'd fill. In this case, reporter Clark Kent at the Daily Planet. A lot of people hate this Superman because he seems broody and lacking in optimism. It doesn't have that inspirational, lighthearted tone Superman is supposed to have, and for all its talk about hope in a better way, that's reflected in its visual style. The movie has this bleak, muted color palette. The suit itself, by the way, is colored much more traditionally in reality than it's corrected to look in the movie, and most of the daytime scenes that look kinda overcast in the film were bright, sunshiny, and perfect for a Superman movie kind of days. A lot of people think this just isn't Superman, and it's a cash-in on the dark and gritty trend masquerading as Superman. But is this a movie about Superman, or is it about the man who becomes Superman and how he got there? Does the world look Matrix bleak because that represents the fatalistic mindset of our society? Does it maybe still look that way by the end because the world hasn't accepted Superman, and maybe because he still has a long way to go? Or is it just because Lawrence Fishburne's in this movie? Now, you may say Superman has to be raised with those values instilled in him by the Kents from the get-go, or this isn't Superman. But I've read alternate origins that see Superman coming from a more selfish place initially, and then creating that persona of the ideal, portrayed as a caring but flawed human being who, like a lot of other superheroes, struggles with having a personal life and being the selfless hero at the same time. And sometimes I still buy that that's really Superman. There's some of J. Michael Straczynski's Superman Earth 1 in this movie, except that instead of wanting to be a hero but his parents won't let him, that Clark's parents encourage him to put on the costume, and he resists the responsibility. Because that would be absolutely terrifying for a young kid just out of high school. Oh, and side note, why is it sometimes considered more realistic for a superhero not to think of a costume until somebody else suggests it? A costume is just a disguise that you wear so no one will see you do your thing. It would be harder to get away with that in a tiny town like Smallville, admittedly, although I have no idea how this Superman manages to keep a secret identity at all with all the people who already know Superman and Clark are the same person from the beginning, and when Clark is telling the military he was raised in Kansas? But why doesn't it occur to Clark before he meets Jor-El to do something practical to hide his identity? Especially when he's traveling around the world. I mean, that's a no-brainer for bank robbers and jewel thieves. Now, me personally, I'll admit I don't love starting Superman in a place of being raised to distrust people on principle. It is a long climb from there to anything close to what Captain America is in the movies, a hero that gives everyone the benefit of the doubt and fights a constant battle against modern cynicism. And again, you don't have to make him perfect. Steve Rogers sometimes doubts himself and doubts people, and that struggle is what makes him so endearing. Winter Soldier is the best example to date of what a dark Superman movie could be. A movie where the world around him is dark, but he is the light at the end of that tunnel, telling people not to go in there when there's a tornado. But taking this movie on its own terms, I think I could be made to believe in a Superman who does start from that distrusting place. He does want to trust people, and he's just waiting for opportunities he's proactively trying to seek out, but can't find on his own. But like with the mixed messages I'm getting about Jonathan Kent, I can't decide if the movie thinks he's truly become Superman by the end. And that's because there's no discussion at all about some of his more questionable actions. Anybody noticing a pattern here? Man of Steel presents us with two different Supermans. Supermen? Oh, no, that's when you have different people wearing super suits. Okay, Supermans. And he's defined by what we're expected to pay attention to and what we're asked to ignore. What we're supposed to see is the man who's a compulsive hero, always does the right thing no matter what, who finds hope in people through Lois and returns that hope to the world by picking us over the Kryptonians, all the way to killing the only other member of his race when Zod forces him to choose between us, saying he's going to make Superman's adoptive people suffer and either you die or I do. Kind of backs him in a corner. But the other Superman is the prop that fuels big action scenes. We're not supposed to think at all about what he does when the punches start flying, evidenced by the fact that a military that initially doesn't trust him begins to after he brings a superpowered brawl to downtown Smallville, tackling Zod and blowing up a gas station in a mad rage, giving no thought at all to what direction he's flying miles in before he gets there. I mean, he could have gone in virtually any other direction and hit nothing but grass, corn, or trees. And sure, maybe he doesn't totally know his own strength yet. Maybe he lost control. But he just gets up and starts fighting again. Right there in town. Not even a hint of hesitation or worry that he's doing anything to put people's lives in jeopardy. At this point, Zod and Feora don't care at all about the humans, or how Superman feels about them. If Superman were to fly off into a vast cornfield, they would just follow him. They need the Codex. But he chooses to stay in the town he grew up in and demolish, among other things, an IHOP where a kid he once saved from drowning works, and the Sears, where his mother is employed because he didn't save his dad and she has no other recourse to make ends meet but to work there. When the battle is over, the jet fighter leader Guardian says this man is not our enemy. I mean, yeah, okay. You delivered a man who lived among you as a U.S. citizen his whole life into the hands of an alien terrorist. And yet, he still helped you fend off said alien terrorist and work to create that bond of trust. But you've clearly missed that he also put lots of people in danger himself and that he's a huge liability. I guess you're also ineffective in taking these gods down by yourself, so you don't have a lot of choice. But again, we're not talking about it. We're not really telling any story during these explosion fests, and it's hard for me not to just tune out, which is why I didn't even notice the collateral damage the first time I saw this movie. Superman didn't make the decision to take the fight to Smallville. Snyder did. And that's almost how the characters in the movie play it, completely oblivious to decisions he makes that have scary implications. But then, the action is at the fore. Important plot elements aren't made explicit or aren't well thought out in the first place, and so the stuff the movie wants you to take as evidence that Superman really does deserve to wear the symbol of hope on his chest gets buried. And I realize a lot of that collateral damage stuff is going to come back to haunt Superman in Dawn of Justice. A lot of you will have already seen that movie by the time you get around to falling asleep to this review. But no matter how well it handles that stuff, it can't retroactively change the fact that in the moment, no one's naturally reacting to it as they should be. It doesn't feel like a setup movie that sees Superman making a lot of mistakes he's going to have to pay for later. Again, I think it wants to be Batman Begins, an origin movie that completely stands on its own, but creates a sandbox that can be played in again later. So back to my original question, when Superman kills Zod, is his value system firmly in place, or is this a defining moment? I can't answer that. And that's why I think a lot of people find that scene so distasteful. Sure, some people wouldn't like Superman killing no matter how carefully and organically the movie built to that moment. If he's supposed to be Superman, wouldn't he at least try to find another way? But I think a lot of viewers could be made to believe he had no choice and that the alternative was much worse. And then we can simply argue about whether or not Superman should ever be placed in that situation. I think a more thoughtful scenario could have been contrived, slowed down to a deliberate and uncomfortable degree so we had to live with Superman longer and feel how impossible this choice is for him. And we could have been made to feel like letting Zod kill those people would have been just as deplorable as a lot of people think snapping his neck is. In short, we have to be in Superman's head, or that scene doesn't work any more than Jonathan's death does. And this scene is almost as contrived. We've heard all the arguments. Why didn't Superman try to fly Zod up through the ceiling? Why don't those people run forward and away from Zod's heat vision while Superman's holding his head still? Apparently an earlier draft saw Zod getting sucked into the Phantom Zone with the rest of his soldiers. But Goyer thought the film needed a punchier ending. So against Nolan's protest, he came up with this forced scenario where Superman kills Zod. It's weird to me that Nolan was able to veto Snyder's plans to add an after-credits scene, but he couldn't stop what Goyer had to have known would be a really controversial and potentially divisive narrative choice. Yes, hindsight is 20/20, but this is supposed to be the first movie of your DC shared universe, and you're gonna have Superman snap a guy's neck? Really? Again, I'm not saying it couldn't have been more convincing, and I'm not even against it on principle, but it strikes me as a weird risk. Sure, Warner's needed to take more risks with their superhero movies, but since this writing team was a proven goldmine, I imagine there wasn't a lot of studio interference, so in their minds, that wasn't a risk at all. I just think if you're gonna go there, you have to rewrite your movie and naturally build up to it. There's just enough in Zod's taunting that I understand why Superman thinks he has no choice once I sit down and really think about it, but it all happens too fast, and the overall pacing is so wonky it seems to come out of nowhere. I want to read so much into that scene, and I can't because it watches like an afterthought. There's an inherent parallel between Superman feeling it necessary to kill Zod, and Zod feeling it necessary to kill Jor-El, but I'm not sure what to do with all that. Superman lets out a gut-wrenching, haunting scream, echoing the one he belted out when he let his father die. We know that Superman lives to preserve life, but I don't know if we've seen enough of that to really appreciate how hard this is supposed to be for him. It's all in the presentation. We don't have enough time to process what Superman does before the movie is over, and there's everybody do a shot now, no discussion about it, and there's a jarring tonal shift between Lois embracing Superman after he kills Zod, and a scene that's trying to be humorous, where a Superman who just caused a lot of property damage and endangered a lot of civilians, though we're not supposed to have noticed that, drops an expensive satellite right in front of Swanwick's Humvee to tell the government to stop spying on him. The biggest roadblock I see standing in the way of this being the great character study I think it wants to be is Zack Snyder. Snyder's action sensibilities are at odds with the material on the page, and his priorities aren't always Goyer and Nolan's. Now, I do appreciate that Superman finally has some worthy adversaries to fight, even if they're sort of the same worthy adversaries he fought in the only other really good action-heavy Superman movie. Some defenders of Man of Steel complained when critics said it overemphasized the action, saying that you just can't make anybody happy. He didn't fight enough before, and now he fights too much. Wrong! That's not the problem. Tell a story and add action to taste. There's not some magic recipe that gives you the perfect ratio of discussion to butt-kicking to make an audience invested in your Superman. If you're gonna blow up downtown Smallville or have Superman get shot in the eyeball with a bullet, do it because it serves your story. The key is to stop being afraid that Superman's not human or relatable and just put obstacles in his way that make it hard for him to uphold his principles. Just having power can be as scary and difficult and make for great drama as being powerless. Snyder proved himself great at adapting a story fully mapped out for him on a comic book page with 300 in Watchmen. And of course, Watchmen is one of my favorite superhero movies of all time. And so when you think of comic book movie directors, you think of Zack Snyder. But the problem with Warner's logic that he's a good fit for this because of that track record is that he has to interpret a script for a totally original story here. And he has proven he's not great at that. Snyder isn't a storyteller. He's a music video director, or maybe a theme park ride producer. Like Gary Goddard, the guy who made Masters of the Universe. He'll sometimes have some really imaginative ideas, but he's not a character guy, and he's most certainly not a character study guy. The story is secondary to the action, and that's a huge detriment here, with a script that has a lot of big ideas and complicated mythology. Snyder seems to have this attitude, both in the way the movie is made and the way he talks about it in the special features, that all that pesky story stuff gets in the way of what the audience is really there for. There's a visual commentary on the Blu-ray that plays like a behind-the-scenes featurette that's organized chronologically along with the movie. While it doesn't clear up anything like everything, it's absolutely crucial in understanding the movie. I'll give Snyder this. Like Bryan Singer on Superman Returns, he does seem passionate about making this movie, if not for the material itself. Unfortunately, his priorities are out of order. It's unbelievable just how much is left on the cutting room floor, and I don't just mean footage. I mean things that were built, and he just doesn't put a camera on. I learned 5 times more about what this Krypton is supposed to be in the 15 minutes he and his crew talk about it in the commentary than I did in the film. And they're not just elaborating on things that are there, they're providing a supplemental wiki page that is vital to fully grasping that culture. Some of it you can't technically use to support any kind of interpretation of the material. It's just not part of the movie. For example, these Kryptonians apparently live underground because they render the surface of the planet uninhabitable. We see barren terrain, but I never understood the full implications of that just looking at it. I never would have guessed how fully realized this world is because Snyder doesn't take advantage of a lot of what was built for it. The scope of the council set is massive, but I don't get that sense watching it. And in a movie with a lot of green screen and visual effects, when you go out of your way to build something like this, you want to get some coverage. Snyder shoots everything too close. He shoots it all on Handycam in an attempt to make the experience feel more real, which only serves to make it harder to look at stuff you want to see. I had a similar experience with J.J. Abrams' first Star Trek movie. It's like I'm only allowed to see your world through a keyhole, and occasionally I'll get quick glimpses of the vastness of it. That distances me from these characters and shrouds things in mystery for no good reason. I can feel the palpable frustration in the voices of prop, set, and costume designers in the commentary at all all this care that went into creating a living, breathing world, both on Krypton and on Earth, that isn't allowed to fully enrich the movie. This should be one of those movies that every time you go back and watch it, you notice a little bit more, and I'm not having that with it. There's so much physical detail that's there, but Snyder's hiding it from us that informs these people, like all the newspaper and magazine clippings on the wall behind Jonathan in the storm cellar about alien and UFO sightings. That's always in soft focus, and if we got one good look at it, it would help us understand his rampant paranoia about someone discovering what Clark can do. And again, if this was played as more of an unhealthy obsession, I might understand and sympathize more with Jonathan. Why don't we get to see more of that meticulous detail that he actually made sure was all over Watchmen? Why is he shooting dialogue scenes in Smallville like Smallville? You have tons of production value. You're not making a TV episode with $12.50 that's all talking heads and fights with principal actors possessed by villains that would have to be CG creatures to put on screen, but you can't afford them, except when you do put them on screen for all of 6 seconds as a big season climax. And the special effects are weirdly inconsistent. I understand that this is a sci-fi movie. You've got a guy flying, you've got people shooting lasers out of their eyes. You have to create an entire alien world. You can't get away with shooting nearly as much practically as Nolan did on his Batman movies. And I do appreciate how much of that Snyder did. He dropped a real school bus in a river. There's a completely physical prop for Clark's pod in the storm cellar, and Snyder blew up a lot of building facades in a real small town. I'm also impressed with a lot of the CGI. While it's cringeworthy listening to Michael Shannon snarkily try to hide how clearly annoyed he was to have to wear a motion capture suit and give a convincing performance without the bulky costume he had to pretend he was wearing, it looks real in every frame. But then the practical effects and the wonderfully well-integrated visual effects make the obvious CG that much more obvious. And I'm taken out of the movie and thrown into the video game Snyder wishes he was making. Sometimes actors feel like they're part of a CG world rather than people giving real performances, especially during the extremely over-the-top showdown between Superman and Zod at the end. I understand these are two extremely powerful men, but there's a lot of stuff Snyder has these animated versions doing that he just can't make look real enough to warrant them. Some of this might sound like nitpicking, but a lot of Snyder's choices strike me as careless, and they just make the movie look cobbled together, like a bunch of people all thought they were making a different movie. And honestly, I think that's exactly what happened. Man of Steel is like a gallery of paintings that mostly are really interesting and had a lot of artistic merit on their own, but hang them all up in a room together, and the ensemble just doesn't make sense. The questions about the nature of life with the Krypton stuff are fascinating. This is maybe my favorite interpretation of Lois Lane on film to date. Nearly every casting choice is great, and I actually like this Superman when I ignore the stuff all the characters around him don't seem to notice he's doing either. But Snyder struggles to take all these elements and create a cohesive whole, and he just doesn't know when to show, when to tell, and when to stop and smell the roses. Like The Dark Knight Rises, characterization is secondary to plot, but it has the opposite problem in that it's a potentially brilliant movie that isn't effectively realized on screen. It's a movie I'll watch again for all the things I've always wanted to see in a Superman movie, but with my fingernails firmly implanted in my scalp as I'm perpetually scratching my head. This is another impossible film to score, but just as with Rises, it's certainly above average in the grand scheme of superhero movies, so I'm also giving Man of Steel a 2.5 out of 4. And now you'll have to excuse me, I have an Easter egg hunt to get to. I will find them!